Paul has been explaining to the church his great care and concern for them. He mentions something that a lot of preachers have found out if they've been in this work long enough, that a lot of times your work may go unappreciated, may go unrecognized. He says at verse 15 of the 12th chapter, "And I'll very gladly spend and be spent for your souls, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I'm loved." So our work and our faith, the things we might do for others, don't always go appreciated. So just, if we would just take his sentiments here, it's clear, because this is a man that had gone far beyond what preachers today might ordinarily do, and that's okay, because I believe Paul was given a special sphere that would explain these travels. He was a single man also, but it would explain his travels and persecutions, great persecutions, because God had told him to go into these hard places. And when he was afraid at Corinth, God told him to stay. I have many people here in this city. And he stayed and he went to work. And so he explains and mentions this sentiment. And I thought it would be worth mentioning to you and I to just understand that what we do in Christ may not always be appreciated, but the Lord, as Paul said, "I know whom I have believed in." See? And Paul said, "I'm persuaded he's able to keep what I've committed to him." So irregardless to whether the Corinthians might appreciate or care for Paul the same way that he cared for them. See, whether or not that's the case, we need to be like Paul, be persuaded, though, that the Lord is able to keep whatever we commit to him. See, whatever we lay on the line, persecution, struggle, sacrifices, see, loving him greater than our families. Many times we suffer great hardship, see, because of the pains we have in dealing with just our family members, staying loyal to the Lord as opposed to loving father, mother, brother, sister, daughter more than him. And there's great sufferings as a result of things like that. But he's able to keep what we commit to him. And he said against that day that when you show up, when he comes back, whether we are alive, Paul says, whether we wake or sleep, we can live together with him. See, when he comes back, and he'll have that record of all that you put on the line. See, Paul said, I know he's able to keep what I've committed to him against that day. See, take that to be the judgment day. So as he proceeds, he's afraid that they had turned back in some areas. Some, he mentions these, if you'll notice at verse 20, he says, I fear lest when I come, I shall not find you such as I wish, and that I shall be found by you such as you do not wish. And he says, lest there be, and look at this list now. This, can you picture this in the lives of Christians? He said, lest there be contentions and jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, backbitings, whisperings, conceits, and tumults. Well, them just the nasty, horrible attitudes that you see many times people hadn't put off that are in Christ. It's unfortunate. And if these things creep into any of our lives, and they can, that's to our own demise. But he has a fear that when he gets there, that he may find these things. But then he's also, it ratchets it up a notch, because some had gone beyond these nasty attitudes and they were committing fornication, lewdness, vile, immoral behaviors and things. And so he says, lest when I come again, verse 21, my God will humble me among you, and I shall mourn for many who've sinned before and have not repented of the uncleanness, fornication, and lewdness which they have practiced. And so you see the gravity of what he's talking about. That these aren't things to play with here. These aren't Christians not studying as they ought to, and maybe not praying as they ought to, although those are problems too. But you can see the level of his concern here because of the great problems here in some of their lives. And he seems to be, giving a heads up to these, because he has mentioned that they've not repented of these things. Now, the brother had repented, and that's how it is, isn't it? See, some will be like Butch and make things right. As shameful as the behavior may be, they love God, see, greater than any shame they may face or any people looking down on them in a certain way. They love Christ greater. And that the love of Christ, as Paul says, compels us. See, what he's done for us, it drives them to straighten out their lives, no matter what it is. But here's some, though, see, that had not. See, they conceal theirs, or they resist getting out of things as horrible as fornication and this uncleanness. All of this seems to have some sexual connotations to it, that list there. Uncleanness, lewdness, see, that type of immoral behavior. But be that as it may, so that's what you get, isn't it? Some will straighten it up and some won't. Well, he mentions something that he's going to do when he gets in town. He says, if you'll notice at verse 1, now this is the third time I'm coming to you. And then he states a principle that Jesus Christ mentions. See. Of course, incidentally, there's a little disagreement over how many times Paul visited. We won't go down that road too deep. I hold the view he'd only been there once before. This will be his second visit, even though this language sounds like I'm coming through there. This will be my third time. And that may be what he's saying, because that's clearly what it looks like, isn't it? But if you notice up here at verse 14, look at the careful reading of this. Now, for the third time, I'm ready. I'm prepared to come to you. And some, as I contend, that down here, what he's saying is, I've tried to come to you several times. That's what I say that, in the first letter, we know he had started the church. Acts tells us that. Acts 18, Paul's in town. He's there. Well, in the first letter, though, he writes and he says, I'm going to come through and get the contribution. Remember? 1 Corinthians 16. Year later, his second letter fires off, no contribution. He says, I sent some guys in there. I'm going to come through. Get it up because the Macedonians may be with me. No visit. But then in this letter, the second letter, he explains why I didn't want to come to you because of these problems y'all got, and I didn't want no bad visit, no negative visit when I got there. So I wrote this letter instead of having to come in a spirit. So he says, do you want me to come with a rod? See, he didn't want to come like that, and he explains that in this letter, no visit. He's planning to come, and he says, even in the first letter, some are puffed up as though I'm not coming. No visit. But be that as it may, so that when he says, they don't read the same. Verse 14 and verse 13 here, chapter 13, verse 1. Now, for the third time, I'm ready to come to you. And then this will be the third time I'm coming to you. They don't, they ain't necessarily the same thought there. Not necessarily. It could be, but be that as it may. But he's not going to listen to any hearsay and all of that. And the way you solve that is at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. See? Boy, it's hard to nail down fornication. You ever tried that? Like, or to nail down adultery or something. People, boy, it's a lot there, ain't it? Do you see it? Well, how do you solve it? Well, he says at the mouth of 2, when I come, this will be the third time I'm coming to you. And then he quotes what Jesus said. Now, I know this is found back in Deuteronomy. And that may be what he's referring back to that. He doesn't say that here. A lot of times, he'll say it, and it is written, and then we know he's taken this from the Old Testament. But Jesus said this. In Matthew 18, you remember he says, if your brother sins against you, go to him. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. But he says now, but if he won't hear you, take with you 1 or 2 more, that at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. And that's talking about the church, isn't it? Because he says, and if he won't hear them, let him tell it to the church. See, Jesus put this in place in the new covenant. And we need to follow it. Now, it's hard not to follow it. Now, a lot of times, if we like a brother, we'll take what he says. I know him, he's a good brother, and boy, he wouldn't lie to save his neck. And they run with that without establishing the words. See? Or here's somebody, he's faithful. I've known him my whole life. He wouldn't dare. And they run with that because of a good brother, a good faithful brother. But we've all been bit by that. Don't do it. Establish all the words. And that way, and especially if we're dealing with charges and accusations, right? Like elders are protected from the harm can be done by brethren whispering about elders, running around, brother, he's like this, he's like that, he's like this, he's like that. Well, Paul told Timothy, don't do it. He said, don't receive an accusation. 1 Timothy 5, I believe. Don't receive an accusation against an elder, except, without witnesses. This principle here, that because these men have lived a lifetime building up their reputations. And one of their qualifications is to remain blameless, that they can't have charges hanging over their head. They have to make things right. They have to, you can't be an elder being blamed, not being blameless. Now, men may blame you. They do all the time. It don't mean there's no substance to it necessarily. But the point is, we need to establish words, and good men's reputations are protected, even by this principle here. See, so somebody runs to you with something on one of the elders, don't receive it until you get something substantial, and that is some witnesses to substantiate what it is, whatever it is you're accusing them of. Don't do it. And that way, we can live with the words being established, because that's God's will, even though we may not understand all the facts, all the whatevers, but we can't just take people's word for things and because of who they are or their faithfulness and all of that. That flies in the face of the wisdom of God. See? So you got a problem with a brother, you go to him, he sinned against you, he won't hear you, and you go, and instead of getting some witnesses, you go tell it to everybody. They did you wrong. He did me wrong. He did me wrong. He did me wrong. He did me wrong. And that thing gets all over the church because, somebody run their mouth instead of trying to gain their brother, which Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, go to him alone, between you and him alone. If he hears you, he said, you've gained your brother, case closed. But if he don't, he says, go take one. Now, your word's good, isn't it? He says, go take one more with you, or two. See, one would get you in there at the mouth of two. It would get the person involved in the problem. You can take his word. You just can't take it solely on his word. You see the issue there? So, let all the words be established. This principle here it can save men's reputations, congregation, a lot of grief if they would just establish all the words. See, and don't buy into that devilish thought that somehow some man's word is to be. It overrides this principle of God. Nobody's word. Don't do that. No man is worth you losing your soul over. Establish all the words. Brother Hall.
I think like you said, put so much confidence in the word of someone who believes in faith.
Mm-hmm.
And yet Jesus made the statement in John 5 that if I bear witness of myself,
Mm-hmm.
my witness is not true.
That's right.
And then he goes ahead to appeal to John and appeal to God as witnesses, even in his behalf.
Good, great point. Good thought. Y'all hear that? Jesus said even his word ain't good enough to hold. He's following these principles, isn't he? He's following the law. He didn't put himself above the word of God. See, great point. Any thoughts or comments along these lines? At the mouth of two or three witnesses, let every word be established. So, Paul says, now I've told you before, this verse is cumbersome. A lot of disagreement over what this verse means. I've told you before and foretell as if I were present the second time, and now being absent, I write to those who've sinned before and to all the rest that if I come again, I will not spare. Most believe this verse is saying, I've told you before, and I told you on my second visit with you. Look, if you got the ESV, American Standard, New American Standard, it'll sound just like this. I told you before, and I'm telling you now, like I did when I was with you on my second visit, and now I'm writing ahead to those same ones that I'm going to deal with them when I get there. That's what it seems to be saying. Does someone have the New American Standard? I think Dave left. Who got it? Reuben, read that, please.
This is the third time I am coming to you. I'm sorry. I have previously said when present the second time, and though now absent, I say in advance to those who have sinned in the past and to all the rest as well, that if I come again, I will not spare anyone.
All right. I told you before, I'm paraphrasing, and I'm telling you, like I did on my second visit with you, and I'm writing now to tell you. Okay? New King James seems to be saying to me, I've told you before, And I'm telling you now in advance, as if I were with you a second time. Not that just like I told you when I was with you on my second visit, not that. But I've told you before, I'm telling you now, as if I were with you for time number 2, but I'm writing instead to those who have sinned and all the rest, that is the view I hold. But be that as it may, as cumbersome as these verses are, I don't think any 1 ounce of any of this, matters in terms of someone's faith or they're going to heaven or serving God faithfully. These are things that are hard to be understood at times, and especially the hard part is reconciling them. It ain't necessarily always just in the verse itself, but if that verse is saying this, well, he done already said this and this. See, so to harmonize it all is the toughness, the hard part of some of what he says. But be that as it may, any thoughts on that or anything along those lines, I don't think that matters hardly at all on just exactly what he's getting at there. But what he is sure about, we all in agreement on, is that he's writing this letter. Did you notice that he says, I write to those who have sinned? That's a little different, isn't it? He ain't hiding who he's talking to. A lot of times, because you may not want to cause a problem or whatever, you might veil who it is you're actually talking about. Nobody knows who you're talking about. Is everybody wondering, who is he talking about possibly? And you don't see that a lot of times from the apostles in their preaching and teaching. You really see this openness. And I've always been impressed with the fact that he singles out people for the world to know. And churches cry autonomy all the time, and they don't want nobody to know that this brother's this brother here is in adultery. And that's a church autonomy. That's a local problem, and nobody ought to be involved in that. See, and so somebody gets in adultery, and they can run over to this congregation, and good brethren maintain. That's got nothing to do with you. They're not your problem anymore. They over there. Going, really? See, so Paul tells everybody it's a fornicator at Corinth, the whole world. See, but we can. This is a local matter right here. See, when brethren start church hopping, carrying their problems and divisiveness from church to church. See, and brethren try to discipline, well, they just leave and run to another church. See, and everybody goes hands off because they ran to another church. That's that church's problem now. And if you try to deal with that church, they'll tell you, well, not one church can't withdraw from another church. They start that stuff. So, but that ain't what we see here. Paul says, I write to those who have sinned before. That's the same language as verse 21 of chapter 12. And I shall mourn for many who have sinned before and have not repented of the uncleanness. He talking about them brethren. I'm writing to these who hadn't straightened up their fornication, uncleanness, and their lewdness. I'm writing to them. And he says, because I'm going to deal with them, see, that if I come again, I will not spare. So he tells, not only does he call them out, he said, and I'm going to deal with them. That's a little different preacher, isn't it? And he says, and to all the rest. Anybody want to take a stab at who them people may be? Here's these that have sinned before. And then he says, and to all the rest, I'm going to deal with them. Excuse me? False apostles, I agree 100%. Any others? What about these who accuse Paul of walking according to the flesh? He said, I'm going to deal with them, didn't he? In chapter 10, he says, but I beg you that when I'm present, I may not be bold with the confidence by which I intend to be bold against some who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. He's going to deal with them too, ain't he? Now you got it's immorality, but he says, and to all the rest. And it's another set. Here was some, he says that they were saying things like, his letters are weighty, but his bodily presence is he's kind of puny, isn't he? He doesn't look like much. And Paul says about them, verse 11 of chapter 10, let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters, when we are absent, such we will also be in deed when we are present. Paul said, whoever's saying that, they need to consider this. When I get in town, they're going to see I'm just like these weighty letters that they're charging me with. That just what you get from these letters is what you're going to get in person when I get in town, is what he's saying. And because he explains, I got authority to use sharpness. And that's what he closes this letter mentioning that at verse 10 of chapter 13, our chapter. He says, therefore, at verse 10, I write these things being absent, lest being present I should use sharpness according to the authority which the Lord has given me for edification and not for destruction. He has full apostolic authority to get after people. And I mean to use sharpness when he's dealing with them. To build them up, to save them, of course, and he makes that point clear in the 12th chapter, doesn't he? That all things, verse 19, we do all things, beloved, for your edification. It's all to build you up. Even if we have to rebuke and deal sharply with you, it's to help you and to love you. And so it really harmonizes well what he's talking about here. But all the rest, he's done is some other little groups in here besides these that he's going to deal with when he gets into town. He says at verse 4, though I'm crucified in weakness, for though he, talking about Christ, was crucified in weakness, yet he lives by the power of God. For we also are weak in him, but we shall live with him by the power of God toward you. Let me back up at verse 3. I didn't get the context. Sorry about that. Since you seek a proof, and this is him talking about, I'm going to come and deal with these that hadn't repented and all the rest. And he says, because evidently some of you need to see Christ working in me. I think that's the idea when he says, since you seek a proof of Christ speaking in me, he says, who is not weak toward you, but mighty in you, talking about Christ. For though he, Christ, was crucified in weakness, yet he lives by the power of God. Jesus Christ was crucified in the flesh. I think that's the simple idea behind him being crucified in weakness, that he died as a man, as fleshly man, and went through that hardship that men face. He died in weakness, but he lives. Now, he was resurrected by the power of God. God working through him, God working in him, God working, because it says he was quickened by the Spirit, the Holy Spirit helped raise Jesus from the dead. And so he died in weakness like you and I do. but he was raised by God's great power, is the idea. And Paul says, we also are weak in him. I want you to notice the parallel that Paul is making. He illustrates his point by showing Jesus was weak and lived by God's power, God working through him. So are we. See, since you seek a proof of Christ working in me. So he illustrates that. Jesus, look at Jesus. He died in weakness. But the power of God, you saw it, you know it, see? That resurrection and its great power in your life. That's what you'll see. He works in us, though we are weak. And he's listed 50 ways he's weak. You remember, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. See? All these weaknesses he has. He says that the power of Christ, you might remember in our chapter, that my grace is sufficient for you, Jesus said. And Paul says, therefore, most gladly I rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. See, I'm weak, but the power of Christ is with me. See, during all these persecutions, we mentioned it, Brother Hall mentioned in that, I mentioned it in the class, he doubled down on it. You know, when Paul gets stoned at Lystra, you can't get yourself up from that beating. See, the power of Christ. See, they left him for dead, thought they had him, and God's great power spared Paul. He mentions that in this letter, doesn't he? That stoning, that's one of his infirmities that he would boast about. See, because it reflects, these weaknesses reflect God working in him. That's why he says, I won't boast in myself except in my infirmities. See, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. See. Any comments or anything along those lines? The power of Christ working in him. Paul says, we are weak, we shall live. Now notice this expression, but we shall live with him by the power of God. See, Jesus lived by the power of God. He says, and we will live by the power of God toward you. See, they looking for a proof. And he says, you're going to see it. We live by the power of God toward you. See, he's not talking about this being resurrected or anything. He's talking about my behavior toward you. You've seen the full apostolic admonition. You've seen it. Because he talks about that, truly the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance and signs and wonders and mighty deeds. And then here's these sinners seeking a proof of Christ working in Paul. And he tells them, you know, y'all ought to know better. But Jesus died in weakness. What you see in us, there is some aspects, see, that they'll look at that like they did at Paul. See, look at his bodily presence is weak. See. And so that's what they prey on, see. But here's Paul going, but these weaknesses, see, what you see is God working in us. As we lay down our lives, as we suffer and go through whatever, you've seen it in our lives. Not only the miraculous gifts and things, see, but we live by the power of God toward you. What you see in us every day is a testimony to God's power working in us.
Verse 17 says, "Can I do it for gain?"
Yes.
Obviously, some people were saying, "Hey, he's trying to make
Mm-hmm.
get money or fame or something."
Questioning his integrity, aren't they? Like, a good point. Contrary, see, to these doubters, see, Paul said, y'all have seen this clean, pure life in me. But he puts the onus where it goes. Examine yourselves. That's what each Christian has the responsibility to do. Now, when you think about all the problems this church had and these current issues that they're facing with these these deceitful workers in there among them trying to influence them, he says, check and see if you are in the faith. Put yourself through a test to see if you are in the faith. And boy, that's a good one. If you know, where are you on these false apostles? Where are you on this contribution? Where are you toward me? You've seen my love for you, and yet the more I love you, the less I'm loved. But is that you? Who is it that don't love Paul? Is it you? Is it you? See, examine yourselves to see whether you're in the faith, to see if you are really what you ought to be. A lot of men, better speakers than I, do a good job with this verse through the years. You know, this examination is that idea of burning impurities from metals. And that's the word there. And so when he's saying, you know, examine yourselves, test yourselves. See, are you impure? You got impurities in you that you need to get out of you. See? He says, unless you're disqualified. See, unless really you don't meet the test. You know, you'd get tested, toss that one aside, but here's a pure one. Here's a good one. See, he says, unless you're disqualified, you can't hold up to this scrutiny of God's word. See, test yourselves. And that test has to come from us, don't it? You know, like I can't, test you and, although that's normally how it runs, most of the testing is on others normally, but it needs to be on us. We may have one more round at it to finish up. I elaborated on that 2 or 3 witnesses on purpose just because I got informed Shane may be unavailable next week, and we'll finish up one more round of chapter 13. But appreciate y'all, the good comments, good points, very much needed chapter for all of us.